Yeah, you mentioned indexes. So, relating to that, what are some of the issues that come across with lack of indexing and kind of misunderstanding them?
Yep. So this is one of those that I don't like to blame the person that's doing the indexes wrong. I always like to blame Microsoft because they didn't really explain how the indexes should work very well to this person or whatever it may be. So, but what we run into is we run into cases where we have a number of different trends here. One of them would be multiple identical indexes. Or let's say you have 4 or 5 indexes on the same table on the exact same columns and exactly identical. With that, uh, having those multiple indexes does two things to impact your performance. One of them is that it impacts the query optimizer because the query optimizer has to look at each one of those and say, well, is this one going to be better than that one? But it also means that whenever you're doing inserts, updates, or deletes, that they're all going to be a little bit slower because each one of those multiple indexes is going to be updated. And having 2 or 3 or even 5 or 10 indexes on a table that are exactly the same gives you no more value over having that single index there. The other thing we run into is where somebody will learn a little bit about indexes and they'll put single column indexes on every column. So let's say you've got a table that has 15 columns in it, and instead of creating one index that's going to help with a lot of your queries, they'll go and create 15 indexes, one for each of the columns, thinking, well, if I have an index on each one of those columns, it's going to help me in all situations. But the problem you run into with that is that the query optimizer will only pick one index per table that it's working on in order to be able to use that to bring back your data as efficiently as possible. So if you've got to select from a table where you're checking 3 or 4 different columns for certain values, if you had an index on all 3 or 4 of those columns, it might give you a quicker lookup than if it was only able to use the index on one of those columns. And SQL Server will probably pick the best column when you have those single column indexes, but it's not going to give you the value of having multiple columns in an index. Now, with indexes, keep in mind that an index is just a copy of those certain columns ordered in a certain way that'll help you get to the data quicker. And if you have 15 columns and 15 separate indexes, you've got 15 copies of all of that data, at least from each column. And if only one of those is ever being used at the time, well, maybe you're not getting the most value out of it. The other thing we run into there is where somebody will have a single index on all the columns. Again, you learn a little bit about indexing. You say, oh, I'll just create an index on 15 columns in the table, and all 15 of them will be indexed. What you can end up with that is that your index can actually be larger than the table itself when you've got those all indexed, and it might help you in a couple of queries, but very rarely would you need all 15 index or all 15 columns in that example in the same index.
Yeah.
And you end up with a lot of overhead and a lot of maintenance around that. The other thing we commonly run into around that is the DTA indexes, or these are what the Microsoft Database Tuning Advisor tells you to create. And if you're running the Database Tuning Advisor, step one, I would say is just stop. Don't use it. Don't listen to it. Don't believe it. Because the Database Tuning Advisor comes back with these really big indexes. And when I look at the indexes that the Database Tuning Advisor creates, it's very similar to what we talked about with the single index in all columns, where it's trying to put as much stuff into that index as possible. And I almost think that the Database Tuning Advisor is a way to push people to create inefficient indexes to make their databases bigger. I don't know, I'm not really a big conspiracy theorist, but it seems like that the indexes that you get out of the Database Tuning Advisor don't always help, and they actually hinder, in my experience, more often than helping. The other thing we see is that when developers are using the execution plan and they get a suggested index, that they'll add every single suggested index that they see. And sometimes it's better than adding another index that's almost duplicate to another, is to just change the original one or drop an original one and add a new one. So there's a lot of ways that people end up creating indexes in their databases that don't really help and oftentimes may hinder. So that's one of the things that we can take a look at and find those things and come up with the right indexes when people have the wrong ones in place there.
Yeah.